You want to tell the story of your product in as clear a way as possible and make as big a splash as possible. Many companies have done that in very different ways. People are going to look at your tagline, click on it, do a deep dive on your product, install it, try it. That loop is so quick and so essential.
Whether you win or not, you've had that opportunity to get the beginnings of a community.
I think that's true, but it's also nice to win.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Rajiv Ayyangar.
There's this saying, first-time founders obsess about product, second-time founders obsess about distribution. The true startup battle is a battle for attention. It doesn't matter how incredible your product is if nobody knows it exists. With AI and a broad ecosystem of tooling that makes building a product quicker and cheaper than ever for everyone, that battle is more fierce than it has ever been before. So what's a founder to do? How can you stand out when everybody else is also trying to stand out? It's not easy, but there are ways. And today we're going to discuss them with the CEO of the company that arguably does more than any other to help startups get noticed. Who is it? What is the company? You'll find out right after the break. Listen up. I know a lot of you use dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of those agencies suck. I've been looking for one I can really endorse, and I finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have 100+ experts who don't just code, they solve business problems. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by .tech domains. One thing about starting your startup that should be easy but isn't is naming it. Why is it so hard? Because all the good .com domain names are taken. So you end up doing something silly like misspelling it or adding random prefixes or suffixes. No more. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so you should make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. Head to get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy to grab your .tech domain today. That's www.get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Rajiv Ayyangar is the CEO of Product Hunt, the platform for launching and discovering new tech products. Before that, Rajiv was in the trenches himself as the co-founder and CEO of Tandem, a virtual office for remote teams. With Tandem, he experienced the full founder life cycle, navigating multiple pivots, pandemic-driven hypergrowth, raising a hot round from top-tier investors, and ultimately making the tough decision to shut down the company. All of which makes him the perfect person to discuss the art of getting your startup noticed. Rajiv, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Thanks, great to be here.
As the CEO of Product Hunt, you have the opportunity to see more new products than nearly anyone else on earth. What do you see the best startups do to get that early traction that the rest don't get?
To some extent, what gets startups noticed is magic, right? At the heart of it all, it's building something that really resonates with people. But if I were to pick out two things that I see again and again, I think it's clarity and velocity. When you first start building a product, like I remember when we first started building Tandem, the virtual office, we had this idea for a product and there's a collection of features and we're using it and we have a problem, but we haven't really figured out how to describe it to people yet or how to tell people about it. One of the things that's so powerful about the act of launching and so powerful about the first time you launch something on Product Hunt or any platform is you are forced to describe in a very condensed way what your product is. And the more practical or the more functional version of that is we force you to write a tagline in 50 characters. That forces you to say, in a few words, how do I describe what I am building? And that tagline needs to do a lot of things. It needs to tell somebody what problem you're solving, how you're solving it, how you're different than every other solution that came before it, who you're for, who you're building for. It has to do so many things. And when done right, it does all those things, but that can be really hard. I spend a lot of time, like when I'm talking with companies that are launching, we often spend a lot of time workshopping that tagline. In fact, one of the things I remember about going through Y Combinator with my last startup is every week, the first question in group office hours was, what are you building? And we would say what we're building, and then we get feedback, like really brutal feedback from our peers. Hey, I didn't understand that at all. The reason clarity is so important is that when you're launching something, you want it to go viral. And you can't get that word of mouth if I don't know what you're building. It's that simple. Like, yes, you want it to be compelling. You want it to be new. You want it to be unique. You want it to be cool. You want it to be all of these things. But above all, if it's not clear, nothing else matters.
An interesting question there from me is about the feedback loop, right? So how often is it the problem that you have a product that solves a clear problem in the world in a unique way and you have difficulty expressing it versus you've never had that clarity of thought to allow you to shape the product correctly, right? So is it when you talk to companies, when you work with them on that 50-word tagline, is it a question of it's just there waiting to be discovered? Or is it quite often that the product as built doesn't really have a 50-word tagline, and that is kind of what reflected by a lack of clarity of product thinking?
That's such a good question. I see both. And I've personally experienced both. I've built, early versions of a product that we couldn't figure out how to describe. The reason was we were trying to solve a collection of problems, a collage of problems. And then also I've had a product where it was very clear to us and to the users of the product what it did, what it solved. But it took a little bit of iteration to express it in a way that everybody understood. And this is part of why launching publicly is like such a valuable first step and repeat step. Like this is why, some of the highest trajectory companies like Supabase has launched 15 times, 16 times, right? They keep launching and they get better. They keep that muscle strong. Being forced to articulate what you do very simply and very clearly clarifies your own thinking and also clarifies the product itself and also starts to help you answer, do people want what I'm building? You could be very clear, but nobody wants what you're building. Or you could be not that clear and you don't know whether people want what you're building because nobody understands what you're building. Sometime in that process, you realize like, oh, I'm building like a couple different products. Let me pick one and emphasize it, like one promise, one positioning statement and emphasize it and launch that. Just to sidebar a bit, there are many reasons to launch. But one reason that I see a lot in really sharp founders is when maybe there's a fork in the road. The product could go in two directions and they have a hunch on one and they launch that direction as a way of gaining clarity.
Not that long ago on this podcast, we actually had the author of a book on the PR FAQ process that Amazon uses, right? And he talked about the fact that a really important aspect of that is that to write that press release, you need a lot of clarity, right? You need to be able to communicate to the world what it is that you're actually building, and that clarity actually gives you the ability to build the product better. And it nearly feels like you're saying, yes, and not only should you write that press release, that tagline, you should actually release the thing as soon as you can and get that feedback from that full body contact with the real world, with real users, and get that early feedback and that iteration going.
Yeah. I think there's something a lot more real about a product hunt launch than a press release.
Yeah.
Granted, I haven't spent a lot of time at very large companies, but a press release is not very close to your users. A press release goes to media. It doesn't go to users. There's something really, I think, a lot more powerful about even drafting your product hunt launch before you start building, because that's going to go directly to users. It's going to go out to people who are going to look at your tagline, click on it, do a deep dive on your product, install it, try it. Like that loop is so quick and so essential that I think it is super valuable to have that loop in mind when you're building. It's like a good friend of mine who does marketing at Adobe give me the framing of the promise versus the product. We talk a lot about product market fit, but a component of that is promise market fit. Like you need to be making a promise to your users that they want. And then the product part is like, then you got to fulfill it. And I think a launch is a way of testing a promise in a really extreme, in a really clear way. If the retention's terrible, then your product doesn't fulfill that promise, but you got to know whether people want it.
Yeah, I love that you say that, because actually, as someone who creates a podcast, this is something that I think about a lot, because if you think about especially the YouTube aspect of what we do, but also more generally, we talk about packaging, and these algorithmic platforms have effectively turned each video into a mini product. And when we talk about the thumbnail, the title, and so on, we say there are two aspects, right? There is the promise, And the promise is what gets you to click on the video. And then there is keeping that promise, which is what gives you the retention, right? If you make an amazing promise and the video doesn't fulfill the promise, you might get a bunch of clicks at first, but people will churn off the video. And it's exactly the same for products. So it's actually nice to see, like a video is a very sort of clear and simple example of that, but it's something that's much more generalizable, right? This idea of, okay, how do you get and keep users? Is you need to make a compelling promise. You need to fulfill that promise. I think that's actually, there's a huge amount of depth to that, right? Because if you've built a product that you cannot attach a compelling promise to, right? That's that tagline, then maybe you're not solving a real problem. But then again, we don't want to say that this is just about distribution, that all you need to do is like, put lipstick on a pig and that's going to work. No, you have to have an amazing product that is fulfilling a promise that people are actually excited about. And so there are those two sides of that same coin. So you mentioned clarity and you also mentioned velocity as the things that, the best startups do to get that early traction. So tell me more about velocity and what you see there.
Velocity, I think about velocity as how quickly are you improving the product in the eyes of your users in ways that are meaningful to them. It's not about how fast you ship code. It's not about, how long you're working, how late at night you're working. Like velocity is measured in the eyes of users and in how much the product is changing in ways that they care about. Not just changing, but changing in ways that they actually care about that are related to the main value. The best startups, once they have that initial traction, follow it up at a very fast cadence. And they communicate it through change logs, through launching again, like major new launches. There are many different ways to like show velocity and also keep yourself internally accountable. Like we like change logs, like a lot of companies do change logs. Supabase has started this trend of the launch week where a few times a year they release a flurry of new features, which allows them to work on more substantial new features for a greater period of time while still having like very high like aggregate velocity. But the reason I think velocity is so important is one, it just builds momentum. And then two, when users feel like your product is changing quickly, they're going to give you more feedback. It's a really helpful, virtuous cycle. When you get more feedback, you can change the product more accurately in ways that matter to users, which leads to even better feedback.
So you think they give you more feedback because they get a more immediate gratification because they feel they are more likely for their feedback to be actioned? Is that sort of the virtuous cycle that you're talking about there?
Yeah, if you look at the opposite extreme, let's take the opposite extreme. Let's say you never change the product. Like, why would anybody give you feedback if they've never seen the product change? They'll only give you feedback as catharsis, like to complain, which is also helpful. But when you start changing things really quickly, people give you a lot more feedback.
Now that makes sense. And I think I'd be interested in your thoughts on how AI tooling is accelerating this trend, right? Because what we're talking about really with velocity here is it's nearly about cycle time, right? It's how quickly you go through that learn, measure, iterate loop, right? And in the past, I think the long pole was often the actual build phase, right? It's like, oh, okay, we've got that feedback.
Yeah.
Now we need to add these features and so on. So in a sense, your ability to execute and to build was somewhat at a premium. But now with a lot of these tools, you can say, well, the build it's not easy. It's still not easy, of course, but these tools can really accelerate your ability to take that feedback and action it and then get it back out into the world. So it seems to me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it from your perch at the top of Product Hunt. To what extent are the best startups accelerating their velocity and taking that feedback even more quickly as a result of tools like Cursor, Windsurf, Claude Code, some of the vibe coding tools and so on?
I don't know the answer to this, but I have guesses. I would love to actually hear from new companies that are starting now with AI tools. To be honest, we've accelerated a ton, but we have an 11-year-old code base. Like there's a complexity and scale there that makes it really, really hard. But even so, a couple things have changed. We're building features way faster, and increasingly, we spend a lot of our time, both engineers and product and design, in user interviews, trying to understand what's working, what's not working. As you said, the build phase is getting shorter, and the understanding phase and the decision phase is where a lot of the magic is now.
I agree with that because you kind of mentioned in passing before, but I think it's really important, right? That velocity is measured in the eyes of the user, right? It is not about activity. It's not about busyness, making changes for the sake of making changes. It is making changes that are directionally correct, that are improving the product in the eyes of your users and of your customers. And so it seems like, the best product thinkers have been preaching the gospel of talking to your customers, of talking to your users for years now. But I think it just becomes more and more important to have this constant contact, right? Because the risk of these tools is that you can just throw more spaghetti at the wall more quickly. And that's not really what you want, right? You can create a complex, confusing product that you don't end up with that 50-word tagline for, because it's easy just to add feature after feature after feature. So to get those cycles to be meaningful, to drive true velocity rather than just thrash, you need to have that really close contact with your users.
Totally agree.
And definitely talking to founders who are, in my network who are working now, like one founder I spoke to said he went from a customer interview, understanding a feature request effectively, to having that shipped in production 2 hours later, right? And this is not like a trivial bug fix. It was a medium-sized feature request. And thanks to these tools and to having that close understanding of what the customer wanted, they could get it to them so quickly. And of course, that then builds a huge amount of trust, because the customer is like blown away that, they've never had a feature request actioned in less than a month, and they got this thing 2 hours after they spoke to the founder. And so, I think that velocity just really allows you to build and build. I think maybe if there's one thing, I know we've got more to talk about, Rajiv, but if there's one thing I'd really love people to take away from our conversation so far, it is that this feedback loop is a virtuous cycle. We talk about flywheels a lot in tech, and it's often about network effects or things like that. But actually this flywheel of customer feedback is one I haven't really heard articulated properly before, which is the faster you move, not only will you have more at-bats, right? It's actually the quality and the volume of feedback will improve because you are building that trust with your users. And I think that's actually a really valuable learning, right? For people to take away and say, oh, okay, if I want people to like my product, then I need to move quickly and be responsive. And I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. And it's most applicable when you have what I would call experience-based products, where users spend a lot of time in your product. Product Hunt is not that. People don't spend a lot of time in Product Hunt. It's utility. It's a launch platform. By contrast, apps like, Cursor or the new collaboration apps like Den, or the voice input apps like Whisperflow and Aqua Voice, right? These apps that people spend a lot of time in. Tandem, Virtual Office, my last app, like those apps, it's so much about the experience. There's so much leverage from improving it even a little bit, because you're going to improve every interaction that a user has throughout a day. The product building velocity matters a lot. And also there's a lot to be gained by just even overfitting a bit to one user, right? If you build that user's pet feature request in 2 hours, they're going to give you 10 times more feedback over the next few weeks. So sometimes it's worth fast tracking a feature request, even if it's not maybe like the most high ROI use of your engineering time.
I think one thing that's been really interesting about the direction this conversation has taken, Rajiv, is, we're talking about the art of getting noticed and about distribution, but really product and distribution are two sides of the same coin. You cannot uncouple them, right? You've got promise and promise kept. And the amazing thing about talking to your users is that you're able to keep updating that promise and building that trust. And so when you've been sharing your advice about how do you get a product that really gets that traction on Product Hunt and just out in the world, you've been talking a lot, not about the distribution, you've been talking about how do you bring these two things together, about how do you have a compelling promise and fulfill that promise in a compelling way, and how do you iterate on that quickly? And I think that's just a really important thing for people to take away, because I know, even in the introduction, I presented this as a bit of a dichotomy, or as two separate things, right? Where you say, oh, first-time founders think about product, second-time founders think about distribution. But really, they're the same thing, right? Distribution drives product, product drives distribution, and you need to think about it as a combined organism.
The Cal.com founder, Pierre, had this 17-page guide to winning on Product Hunt, because he's gotten so many number one spots. And it just said, build a great product ad nauseum. Like, it just was repeated, build a great product, build a great product. And it's definitely an oversimplification, but I do think they are not really that separable. They're two sides of the same coin. Great products come through iterations of launches, and great taglines come from clarity of thought in building a product. And these things feed each other and refine each other and sharpen each other.
So I think maybe the mistake that a lot of first-time founders make is that when they hear build a great product, they think, I'm going to sit at my desk for a year, 2 years, and, just create something amazing. Whereas the truth is that there is only one way to create a great product in most cases, which is out in the world by incorporating feedback, right? So without users, you cannot create a great product. It's funny, there's this idea of like bodies at rest versus bodies in motion and understanding dynamic systems. And I think too often a product is thought of as like this thing that you can refine and polish. But a real, the development of a great product is this dynamic process. And so, yes, to get a great product, you need to care about getting users. You need to care about distribution. And so, after a while, it might seem that all you're doing is building a great product, but that's only possible because you're out in the world and that people have actually noticed you.
And that feedback loop looks different at different stages. It's so fascinating to me, right? Like at scale, that you can still get a really big, significant feedback loop by launching. That's why companies continue to launch. I mean, I was just chatting with Howie at Airtable. Like they launched a major update today on Product Hunt, really kind of shifting the company to be AI first. So you can get that feedback loop at scale. And then in the early days, in the really early days, I think the smallest that loop can be is just as simple as sort of like discovery interviews. Like you talk with a user and you ask them, hey, do you have this problem? Like, what if we built this? And then you dig. And then you change what you're promising in the next user interview until you find something that seems to resonate. And that loop looks different at every scale, but it always encompasses sort of two pieces, like what's the promise and then what's the product that delivers on that promise.
So actually, as you were speaking, I thought maybe I would ask a question that is so basic, it hadn't occurred to me to ask, but I think it might be interesting, which is, what is a launch?
I think a launch is a moment where you tell the world what you are building. If you start to like make communication very abstract, you can start to talk yourself into things becoming very complex. You could say, well, the story I tell my team internally is different than the story we tell our users, which is different than the story we tell investors, which is different than the story we tell press, which is different than the story I tell my mom about what I'm making. And how do I craft communication in all of these ways? A launch makes things very simple. I have to tell the world one thing. I have to tell investors, customers, future prospective employees, our own team, myself, one story about what we're building. What is it going to be? And that forces clarity of thought. And that forces clarity of communication. And that allows you to create something that has virality. And that allows you to have a shot at reaching escape velocity. It's like the downside of launches is always, capped. Like the downside of launches is potentially people just don't care about that format of what you're building or what you're promising. But the upside is always uncapped.
Although, I think there is this thing where, one of the thoughts I had as you were speaking is that a launch is a moment, as you say, where you're able to focus the attention of a community on what you are doing. And, we talked about this idea of promises kept, right? Promises made and promises kept. And a launch is an opportunity. In a sense, what you are launching is a new promise or a refinement of an existing promise. And you're saying, hey, pay attention to this because we are putting a new promise out into the world. And if you actually then click through and use our product, you're going to find that promise is kept. And so there is an element of you want to make sure that you have that credibility and that when you say, hey, I'm launching, what we're really saying is I'm putting a new promise out into the world and that you can actually back that up, right? And so you're actually testing two things at once.
Sometimes people will be hesitant to launch because they'll think, well, what if I get a bunch of users that are not my target user? Like, well, that's a good scenario. You may find that people resonate with your product who you didn't expect and use your product in ways you didn't expect. And in fact, like it's almost definitional. Product market fit is when people are using your product in ways you didn't expect and didn't plan for. Like maybe one way of thinking about this is if you go back to calculus, there's Newton's method of finding a a local maximum, and then there could be global maxima that you can't iterate your way to. The changelog, the velocity, the talking to users every day, that gets you to a local maximum. But those moments where you launch something bold and you go big and you pull out all the stops and you tell your entire network, those are the moments where you can really explore much more widely and you can jump from one local maximum to a global maximum.
But the interesting thing is you can use these products, these launch moments for both, right? You can have these incremental launches and you can have these big bang global optimum launches. I think that's actually a really good mental framework. It's a bit like A/B testing, right? There's this idea that you cannot A/B test your way to a global maximum, which I think is absolutely true. So there are all of these different levels of refinement, right? And what they call the exploration exploitation trade-off, right? Which is, to what extent do you take what you know and take advantage of it to iterate, and to what extent do you forget about what you know and try to explore entirely new domains? And I think launches are a good opportunity to do a bit of both. All the best .coms are taken or crazily overpriced, so you settle on a workaround domain for your website. Don't compromise. Get a clean, sharp .tech domain that instantly says, "This is a tech startup." Grab yours at get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast or via domain registrars like GoDaddy. Looking for a tech partner to scale your business? Here's one I can personally endorse: Warp Development. With 22 years of experience and 100 plus experts, they deliver custom software and AI solutions that drive results. Visit warpdevelopment.com and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Let's take a beat here, and I think it would be great if you could explain in a minute or two for our listeners. I know a lot of them will have used Product Hunt, but for those who haven't, what is the core mechanic of what Product Hunt does and how does it work?
Product Hunt does a few things through a company's lifecycle, but it's best known for what it does at the beginning, which is you decide to launch your product for the first time. You create a product profile that's never existed on Product Hunt before, and it goes on the leaderboard. And there's a daily leaderboard. And people look at your product, like the community people who watch the leaderboard, look at it, upvote it, comment it, try out your product, leave you feedback, maybe leave a review. And that leaderboard is almost like a daily game to see, what the coolest or most interesting or most compelling startup is. And through that game, the most interesting startups tend to rise to the top. After that launch, people launch again when there's a major new update. People will leave reviews on your product as they use it, as you develop real traction, as you go from the promise resonating to the product actually working. There are forums. Every product has its own subforum where people will discuss more things about your product. So this community of like new product nerds and enthusiasts keeps being there for you as you scale.
That word community, I think, is so important, right? Because products launching on Product Hunt benefit from having an existing community, but they also are a way of building a community. And when we talk about community, I guess what we mean in this context is people who care about your product enough to engage with it and engage with the activities around it. And so I guess I'd love to see your thoughts on, what does it take to really build a community beyond the things we've talked about so far in terms of product velocity or whatnot? Getting attention is such an important part of all of this. And of course, that voting mechanism, right? It rewards founders who already have a community. And so if you're giving advice to companies, to founders, saying, how do we create a community around what we do? And what are the benefits of doing that? What's some of the core advice you would give?
Honestly, I think this is a bit outside my area. I stepped into Product Hunt with an existing community. And what I've tried to focus on is make Product Hunt the best thing possible and provide the community with ways to meet. And that has had the result of strengthening the community. My light thought or spicy take here is the best communities come from great products. And then you don't need to do much to crystallize the latent community. You have meetups. People will start to host meetups. You just provide a space for your users to talk and learn from each other and learn with each other. And that's what we've done with product forums. We give every product its own, essentially a subreddit right out of the gate. And so we can sort of just be your community arm and let you focus on building. But I think it all starts with that relationship with your users. Like, are you solving a really core problem for them? To the end, are you solving it well enough that they really really love the product. I actually, like, as a slight digression, this is what I love about what we do at Product Hunt. We get startups noticed, and then we help you find users and customers, and through, from launch to IPO, those early mid phases, but especially the launch, series A, B, C, D, right? And in those phases, your product is so sharpened and so focused that there's a degree of love that you tend not to see when products get like in the later phases. Yeah, it's just a really fun phase to work on.
I wonder, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. Do you feel that there is too much of an emphasis from some in the community around the sort of the voting mechanic on Product Hunt about, the idea of winning your launch? Because what I see a lot of is founders on LinkedIn or on X or whatever saying, hey, please, we're going live on Product Hunt tomorrow. Please vote for me. Please vote for me. And that's why I was saying, well, how do you get that community of people who will vote for you? But maybe what you're saying is that the launch on Product Hunt is actually the opportunity to build your community. And whether you win or not, what you've done is had that opportunity to get the beginnings of a community.
I think that's true, but it's also nice to win. I mean, I think this is where, I've, I think I launched 6 or 7 times before coming in as CEO. And so I have a lot of empathy for the founders launching. It's like every time I launched, I wanted to win. To some extent, that's correlated with just doing the launch right? Like really getting the message out and sharpening the message and reaching the right people. At the end of the day, like if you have users, if you've gotten people's attention, getting the medal, getting the bragging rights is just one small piece of the launch.
But also, I think what you're saying here is that the Product Hunt is a place where your community can live, right? So the launch isn't the end, it's the beginning. We've launched this thing, and whether we won or not, we hopefully have people who have engaged with our product, who are interested in its progress, who will give us feedback. And like you said, you get to launch more than once, right?
Yep.
So maybe your first launch you don't win, your second launch you don't win, but by building up that community, getting that feedback, you get to the point where the product is so excellent that your third launch you might win.
Anybody listening should check out Notion's page on Product Hunt. Look at the launches tab and look at the first launch. Did not do well, but the second launch really kind of knocked it out of the park. And you can sort of see what was compelling about the second launch. I actually remember it. I think I was launching my first app on Product Hunt around the same time Notion. I think it was their second launch in 2015, but it was that combination of, tables, boards, and documents that really hit. But their first launch before that was, I think it was like a multiplayer document. It was very similar to what Quip was back in the day. Kind of fell flat. So if the first launch doesn't succeed, well, you're in very good company.
While we're talking about specific examples, are there any launches that you've seen on Product Hunt over the years that have just blown you away, where you look at them as nearly the canonical examples of getting everything right in terms of putting a launch together?
There are many launches that are exceptional for different reasons. I don't think of a canonical launch in terms of getting things right. I think I actually don't think it's a good idea to approach launches as like, I want to get this right. Ultimately, you want to tell the story of your product in as clear a way as possible and make as big a splash as possible. And many companies have done that in very different ways. For example, one company that stands out is Wordware. They're an AI app builder, like a no-code builder. And they built a series of apps using Wordware. And one of those apps, it was like a Twitter personality test, went insanely viral in multiple countries around the world. And that led to a lot of interest in their launch. And they had the most upvoted launch in the history of Product Hunt. This was like last year. They just made a huge splash. They took a lot of shots on goal, and one of the apps they built with their own app went viral. Hard to replicate. A very small percentage of those users actually converted to their users because they're building an app for fairly technical, although it's not a coding platform, they're building an app for fairly technical users. So there's only a very small conversion, but they made such a big splash because of it that I think it was really, really good for them. So that's one notable launch. It's especially memorable because we thought something was seriously wrong with our systems. It was such a spike in traffic. One category I've been really excited about is voice input.
Oh, me too. We were just talking about it on another episode of the podcast yesterday.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, like Whisperflow and on Aqua Voice. And I was actually just looking at Aqua's launch because I'd remembered they only launched a few months ago and they've got a fair bit of traction. Fast voice input for Mac and Windows is their tagline. So stunningly clear, emphasizing speed. Everything they showed in their launch was about how they get it to be fast. And they do have a lot of other things. Like you can actually edit in Aqua, like as you're talking, because they started out, their previous iteration was like a voice first text editor. So they have some of those features still, and it's very customizable. But the thing they led with was speed. Like there's clarity there that's really powerful.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting, and yeah, looking at voice input as a perfect example, is as the startup community grows, as AI makes it easier to build stuff, you get more and more competition in the same category. And of course, that's difficult for the startups. It's also difficult as a user. It's like, okay, I want a good voice input tool. How do I choose, right? I get this kind of overwhelm. And so to get that really clear message, it's like, oh, okay, fast, yes. I want a fast one. I think that's so important, right? Getting that message clear. What is it you have focused on? You also mentioned just having more shots on goal, right? Which I think is, again, we've kind of covered this a bit, but there's a lot of luck, a lot of path dependency here, right? Where it's like anytime you do anything in the real world, there's like an element of skill and an element of luck. There's signal and there's noise, right? And so the more opportunities you give yourself to actually launch something, get it out into the world and really see how it works, the more chances you're going to have to get lucky. And, they call it, increasing your surface area for luck. So I think that's something also to really think about when we go back to that question of velocity.
2 questions I like to ask before we launch are like, hey, what would give us the best chance of reaching escape velocity? And what will teach us the most? Like, what will we learn the most from?
They should be learning or earning, right? That's the launch version of that. So maybe just to sort of flip it a bit, like, what are some of the most common launch mistakes that you see? Because I often look at the startup world, and it is sadly, it's a place where dreams are made and also a lot of dreams are broken, right? And so when you see founders just making easy mistakes, what is it that you see that frustrates you?
The 2 that come to mind are lack of clarity and then not answering elephant in the room questions. So lack of clarity, look, it's hard to distill what you're building into something very, very simple. Usually what happens is, as founders, we're afraid people don't think what we're building is cool enough, especially in the early days. It's not going to be fully featured. It's not going to be the ultimate platform to do X, Y, Z, and it shouldn't be. But in an effort to make our product sound more compelling, we just lose clarity. I remember it for me, we were building Tandem, my last company. We started building it because both my co-founders had kids like about a year before the pandemic, and we started working from home and we didn't feel like a team anymore. So we built probably like 5 different products in a couple months, and we settled on this product that initially we described as a real-time collaboration platform for remote and distributed teams.
Is that all?
And this is what we had, like a prototype of this when we went through YC. And, when we told people what we were building, their eyes glazed over. They're like, what are you, that doesn't mean anything to me. Like, what's going on there? Eventually, when we got people using it and we asked them how they would describe it to a friend and what benefit they got out of it, we crushed it down to a virtual office for remote teams where you can see who's around and talk in one click. That tagline was the difference between our first few launches, which didn't do that well, got some users, but didn't really take off. And then when we launched on Product Hunt, it went viral, like actually viral. And so I think that clarity is hard to get, but worth striving for. The second mistake, and I see this a lot in the age of AI, is, look, there are some categories that we're just burnt out on. Like we've seen a lot of failed, okay, if I were to back up, AI has accelerated builders tremendously. It's made it really easy to develop a compelling demo, but often those demos are very difficult to turn into actually useful products. So the gap between the launch and a product with actual traction is greater than ever. And because the velocity of building is so high and the velocity of launching is so high, there are certain categories that a lot of people may be burnt out on because they've tried a bunch of things that just haven't worked. And so sometimes you got to explain or allude to in your tagline why you actually work. I think an example of this that's on my mind, apologies to pick on an entire category, but AI SDRs. I see billboards everywhere and I've seen so many launches, and I haven't heard of any customers of those actually saying, yeah, this is amazing. We use this and we love it. And so if you're launching an AI SDR, you got to explain like why it's better. This actually, if we go back maybe a year or so, when there were a ton of code review tools, like AI code review tools that weren't that good, I think Graphite launched one, and they said in their launch, we have a 98% helpful rating. They actually used that stat because they had spent a lot of time working on it to the point where there was very high signal to noise. That is how they stood out. Now I think there are a bunch of, a few companies that have very useful AI code review tools, but sometimes you have to have a good pulse on the ecosystem and know when you have to cut through the noise.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, we were just talking before about voice input assistants. And, what occurs to me is these have been around since the early 1990s.
Yeah.
And, even more recently, on my phone and so on. And, maybe it's, I don't have a US accent or whatever, but they've always been pretty good, but not good enough to actually use beyond a novelty. I'd be like, oh, wow, it's got a 95% accuracy rate, but that's not enough to actually be useful. Beyond a novelty, it's like, wow, this is amazing technology. It's not a useful tool. But just in the last year or so, and I think it's a lot to do with AI being layered on top, these things have become incredible. And I remember I actually use a tool called Willow Voice, which is in the current YC batch. What caught me is it said, when you're using this stuff to write code, it knows the difference between JSON, the person's name, and JSON when you're coding. It'll get that right. And I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm trying this thing. And you know what? And then the promise is fulfilled. It gets it right every time. So now I use this thing daily.
I remember their launch. Yeah, I loved that distinct. That was such a clear way of showing what they have optimized for and like how they're standing out in the field. It's not just a better product. That opens up a whole bunch of new use cases. Like you can now like use it while coding to a much greater degree.
It's the craziest workflow. I have Windsurf open and I just sort of talk at it. I just do a whole bunch of word vomit because it likes a long, detailed prompt, and it just gives better results. It's a pretty amazing way of creating software. You also mentioned not talking about elephants in the room. What did you mean by that?
Sometimes I come across, I'm going to be hard pressed to come up with examples, but sometimes somebody's launching a product and I talk to them and it's in one of these almost like guilty until proven innocent categories where there have been so many products that don't work well.
A new social network.
Yeah, well, more like a tool where people have seen so many other of those tools and they're not differentiating. Sometimes there's a very obvious category leader and you got to describe how you're better than that. Like a few times I've seen like Typeform competitors launch, I think because it's a very popular, more indie maker type app, but they don't describe why they're better than Typeform or, other similar products. So I think if there's like let's see, what's an example of another elephant in the room? In my recent experience, it's usually how well does this actually work? And how does this work well?
What do you think about some of these sort of the X for Y type of framing, right? So it used to be Uber for this or that. Now it's more like Cursor for this or that. Do you think that is a good way of contextualizing your product, or is it something that's actually misleading for people?
It can definitely work. Although it's a bit of a trope, it can work if the company you're using or the comparable you're using is very well known, incredibly well known. It can be a shortcut to clarity, and clarity is what matters above all else. For a while, when we launched product forums, we just described it as Reddit for products. And we even leaned into it with individual forums, p/cursor or p/windsurf. And
very cool.
Was it too on the nose? I don't know, but it was very clear. Super clear for users. And that led to people understanding the concept very quickly, which led to better feedback. So I'm all for clarity. And if Cursor for X gets you clarity, then great. But test it. Like, if your goal is to look better or look bigger or look more compelling in terms of your product vision, you got to test it on users. Like, do they understand what your product does? One helpful reframe question I remember from one of our group partners at YC, Dalton Caldwell, was, hey.
I know Dalton. So I was in YC. He was our group partner. So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, mine too. And I remember he said, from your tagline, I should be able to have some idea how to build it. If I have no idea even what to make after hearing what you're building, you're probably not clear enough.
Yeah, exactly. I think, it needs to be you creating an analogy, right? And so it needs to be an obvious analogy and one where people draw the correct inference, right? You're asking people to do some mental labor. Say, okay, how do I apply cursor into this domain? What do I think that product is? That mental labor needs to be relatively light, and you need to be pretty confident people are going to make the right inferences. I think for me, that's kind of where the line is. And when people say, oh, we're cursor for buses, I'm like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Don't make me think.
Yeah, don't make people think. Don't get cute. Sometimes people get really cute with the lines and there's like a joke or a pun. And sometimes people just overload the terms of art, the jargon. Sometimes people will tell me what they do and they've worked in so many large words that my brain just breaks 4 words in.
Rajiv, I think we've got like the main piece here. Like, I'd love to go into a few bonus sort of like tangent or hot take type questions if you've got time. But before we do that, is there anything you wanted to sort of sum up from what we've discussed in terms of the art of getting your startup noticed, or do you feel we've covered it pretty much?
I'd say clarity above all when you're launching, and launch earlier than you think. I've told this story a bunch, but it bears repeating. When we were working on Tandem, we had this really rough prototype. We were in YC. It was the first week of YC, and our partner Gustav said, "Oh, well, we went to office hours with Gustav, and we said, here's our plan. We have to like fix these features, build these like 5 table stakes features, improve reliability, and then in like a few weeks we'll launch to our within YC, and then a few weeks later we'll launch on Product Hunt." And Gustav said, "You should launch to your batch tomorrow. You should launch to all of YC the next day. And on Thursday, you should launch on Product Hunt." We're just freaked out. I think we were like sputtering excuses and why we couldn't do it. And like, hey, the product isn't really working. We don't think the retention will be good. And he just kind of like listened and like waited until we'd kind of run out of all of our reasons why we couldn't launch on Thursday. And he said, you need to know whether people want this more than you need to know whether you can build it.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty profound.
And that was totally right, because the first couple launches didn't go well, but then we refined it. We refined what we were building. We actually simplified the product by half. We cut out an entire Chrome extension thing. And then the Product Hunt launch went super viral, even though retention was poor. And then we improved retention over time.
We talked about that framework, which I really liked. Make a promise, keep that promise. And that's sort of your end state, right? But it's sometimes worth saying, okay, we're going to make a promise just to see if it's a promise worth keeping, at the very early stages, right? If you make an amazing promise and you can fulfill it, but nobody cares, nobody wants that promise, then you don't have a viable product. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. And be especially wary of promises that will be very costly and time consuming to keep. You need a commensurately high signal that people want that.
Absolutely. So first of all, Rajiv, you're the CEO of Product Hunt, but you're not a founder, and non-founder CEOs are relatively rare in Silicon Valley. So what's your story there? How did you land that gig?
So after I left my last company, I took some time off, did some soul searching, and then I was looking around for what to do next. And Ryan Hoover, who's the founder of Product Hunt, was an angel investor in my last company, and I was brainstorming with him. And I'm shortening it a bit, but he essentially said, like, hey, crazy idea. Product Hunt's looking for a new CEO. Would you want to step in? At my heart, I'm a founder. I want to build new things. I was not looking to be the CEO of a company. And in fact, like if you were to ask me then, I would say there's no company I would be the CEO of that I didn't found, because it's a hard job. But I guess there's one company I would do that for, because Product Hunt has, it's so part of why I did startups in the first place. Seeing Product Hunt in the early days is what caused me to start brainstorming with my future co-founders. It's what caused us to leave our jobs and take the plunge. And it changed my life, and it changed so many of my friends' lives. So I felt and still feel this enormous gratitude towards Product Hunt. And also, when Ryan proposed that, I thought, oh, it could be so much more. Like, I think Product Hunt is just a piece of what it could be and what the startup and tech world sort of needs it to be. So I felt this incredible potential. So I stepped in, and it is very different than being a founder in a lot of ways. But in some ways, it's fairly similar. It's like we're trying to unlock the next chapter, just like
Yeah.
every other startup.
Do you feel a difference now that you're in the seat? Do you treat the role differently than you would have, do you think, if you had been the founder? Or is it like, when you're in the role, you're fully immersed in that role?
I think I just have one mode.
That's what I thought you would say.
I think that's the only way to do it.
I think there's something really nice and meta about what you said about how you got into this role and what you've been talking about this whole episode, which is that build that community of true believers, right? That who really love your product, and they'll give you the feedback. And in a sense, for you, that product was Product Hunt, and you gave feedback so much that you ended up being its CEO.
I suppose.
So it's a kind of cool story. You never know, that you build your community on Product Hunt. One day you might find your next CEO from that community. It's very cool.
Yeah.
From your vantage point, what categories or patterns are you seeing right now in the kind of the flow of products coming through Product Hunt that are gaining real traction, that are kind of inflecting?
So with AI, basically every category is up for grabs. Like we just saw, I don't know if you saw Den, the Slack and Notion hybrid. They're getting a bunch of traction, and their launch went incredibly well, and they'd only been working on it for a few months. After using it, I can totally see them replacing Slack and Notion for a lot of companies very, very soon. This is not something that was feasible, I think, a couple of years ago. But because AI allows us to build faster, because AI features are so valuable, like you can be AI first and actually disrupt an entire category with in a very short amount of time. So to sum up, every category is seeing a lot more disruption than before. The things that have shifted a bit or increased a bit, we're seeing a lot more AI infrastructure and developer infrastructure launching and getting a lot of traction on Product Hunt than before. Like maybe a couple years ago, Hacker News was more the place for dev tools, but there's so many builders and technical founders on Product Hunt that dev tools do quite well. That's one category. Another thing that we've been seeing is voice and voice agents and voice-based companies. And I think the infrastructure there has been maturing so quickly. Like a lot of the companies that are building the infrastructure layers, like DeepGram, Dailyco, which also runs Pipecat, like an open source framework, Vappy, voice APIs. Like these companies have been building for a while. DeepGram actually launched, they pivoted a bit, but they launched in 2016. So the voice infrastructure layer has been, I think, progressing really, really fast, and we're starting to see a lot more applications built on top of that.
Yeah, I'm building something at the moment on top of voice, and it's, like I was saying before, it's something that's just crossed that uncanny valley, and it's really cool. So it's a great place to be working. If you could ban one type of startup from launching on Product Hunt forever, what would it be?
App that create junk social media posts. We generally hide them from the leaderboard because the world doesn't need more AI junk, and they don't really, I think, have that much value in the long term. I think everybody wants an easy button to push where they just get followers.
Yeah.
But it just creates so much noise.
That's funny. I asked you if you could ban something from Product Hunt, and of course you can, and you have. Folks, stop building like AI slop generators. It is not good for the world, and it's not going to work. So you've heard it here from Rajiv. Okay. What's the most overrated piece of advice you hear regularly given to founders?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, here's one area. Like there's a lot of advice about optimizing fundraising, and there's a lot of interest in advice on fundraising. But a lot of fundraising problems are sort of like wishful thinking problems. Often fundraising is really a distraction. I mean, I think of fundraising as like a Maslowian hierarchy of needs, and you try to climb your way up. But if you can get money from people who are going to be neutral to positive at a good valuation, and you can get back to building, like that's pretty great. You shouldn't feel like, oh, I need to, optimize all of these other things, unless you have the opportunity to do so, in which case you should try to climb as high up that hierarchy as you can. But I do think that there's like a disproportionate amount of fundraising advice that isn't necessarily that helpful or relevant to most founders.
And I guess like with a lot of things, like all of building a startup is a giant midwit meme. In a sense, it's like, okay, the best way to raise money is to build a great product and get good traction on it.
Yeah.
All right, the final bonus round question is, what's a product hunt launch that initially totally flopped and then later turned into a huge success?
Well, I mean, I think Hugging Face wasn't that impressive a launch when they first launched. That's a good question. I don't have a ton of examples off the top of my head, but I know it happens. It happens quite a lot. I mean, Notion, I think, is probably a great example of their first launch really flopped. Actually, Notion's probably the best example that most people would know, and that you can actually see their first launch.
Yeah, Notion, obviously a huge multi-billion-dollar success story. Their first launch on Product Hunt totally flopped. So I think that's just, again, a really valuable and concrete reminder for founders that, you need to take multiple shots on goal, and that is how you get there. Rajiv, thanks for being so generous with your time. If people want to learn more about you or follow you online, where should they go?
You can follow me on Twitter. Rajiv Ayyangar is my handle, or just come and hang out in the Product Hunt forums, producthunt.com/forums.
That's right. Launch your product on Product Hunt. It's an amazing community and an amazing tool for the whole startup ecosystem. So really cool what you guys are doing there. Thanks again, Rajiv. Have a great day.
Thanks again. This was super fun.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by .tech domains. Naming your startup should be easy, but it isn't, because all the good .com names are taken or wildly overpriced. No more. You don't have to compromise. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. How do you do that? Head to www.get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy and grab your .tech domain today. Get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast, so they know you came from us. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Warp Development. I know a lot of you rely on dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of these agencies suck. Ask me how I know. I've been looking for one that I can really endorse, and I have finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have over 100 experts who don't just code, they solve business problems alongside you. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp Development delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com. That's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation.